Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are reaching us today at this moment. I want to thank you for joining this Spiritist Talk series, which is promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation. We come together every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm so very happy to be here today to host this talk by Roberto Watanabe. Hi, Roberto. Roberto will be leading our talk today with the topic free will, a power of the soul. Very important topic. I would like to take a moment before Roberto starts talking to remind all of you that the U.S. Spiritist Federation continues to offer the initiation to Spiritism virtual class with a new lesson released every week on Sundays. It is available online and, of course, free of charge. But as you may know already, this class is meant for anyone who would benefit from learning or review the very basic principles of Spiritism, which was, as we know, published by Allan Kardec in 1857 through the Spiritist book. This class, just as we finalize this announcement, is a self-paced class composed of a total of 30 lessons and 8 interactive Q&A sessions. Lessons are released, as I mentioned, weekly on Sundays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. If you are interested or you know someone who's interested who could benefit from this class, please take a moment to visit the course page at the US Spiritist Federation website, which is right there, www.spiritist.us, to access either past classes or for you to receive the reminders by email. Tomorrow, which is Sunday, July 24th, the lesson will be on Allan Kardec, the codifier of Spiritism. You may have seen throughout our topics and themes a QR code. And we just ask if you enjoy this series of live talks and are able to, please take a moment to donate so we can develop new classes, new program. And we appreciate in advance all of you who are able to scan the QR code on screen and help us produce future publications of books and promote Spiritism to everyone. Now, back to Roberto. I am so very happy to be here today and get to introduce you, Roberto, together, and I say together with all of you who are watching this live broadcast, which is simultaneously presented via Facebook and YouTube channels. We want to give you a very warm welcome. We hope you're doing well. It is so good to have you here. And this topic is amazing. Free will, a power of the soul. Some of the concepts relative to, freedom and free will, and especially as they intertwine, may not be so clear to all of you. So glad that you'll be able to discuss that and also offer link to how perhaps free will is a foundational attribute to all of us, right? So I say such an interesting topic, especially as you will also pinpoint to all of you who are interested the relationship between free will and determinism, or some people call it karma, right? That fatal, we have no freedom to get away from what's already pre-planned for you. So I can't wait to hear from you, Roberto, and how this concept really means to all of us as spiritual beings, immortal souls. But I'm sure you are as eager to hear from Roberto as I am. So before he can begin his talk, let me introduce Roberto to all of you who may not know him. Roberto Watanabe is currently the president of FEESP, the Spiritist Federation of São Paulo in Brazil. He leads courses on continuing Spiritist education, courses on Spiritist philosophy. He holds a bachelor degree in philosophy and business and an MBA from PUC in Brazil, in São Paulo. Roberto, on behalf of the U.S. Spiritist Federation, and we thank you for all your support to the awareness and education about Spiritism. I also thank you for your leadership and most specifically for enlightening me and all of us today. Before I forget, please take this opportunity today to send your questions. Use the chat window. Roberto has reserved time to address your comments, your questions, once he concludes his presentation. Roberto, please go ahead.
Thank you, Marcia. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here again. I was here last year. And today I'm going here to talk about free will, like Marcia said. And to talk about free will, we must start by talking about freedom, which is closely related. And what is the definition of freedom according to the dictionary? We have two definitions here. The first one is freedom is the power that has the citizen to exercise his will within the limits that the law provides. So this is more like a legal aspect of freedom, right? And the second one is more personal, which is the condition of the one who does not find himself subjected to any physical or moral embarrassing force. So that is the definition of freedom here, which is close to that of the Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century before Christ. So Aristotle said that freedom, he who has in himself the principle of acting or not to act, is free, has freedom. That is, the one who is the internal cause of his action or the decision not to act. So this is what Aristotle thought about freedom, which is the definition that we have until today. And then we must talk about if do we have absolute freedom? Kardec asked that in the Spiritist book. And the answer from the Spirit is that there is no position in the world where man can boast of absolute freedom, because we need one another, right? So all of us need one another. We can't live alone. And so the Spirit says that as soon two individuals are brought together, there are rights to respect. So it means that my right, for example, goes until the point where the right of my neighbor begins. So we are constrained in some way by each other rights, right? So in that sense, we no longer have absolute freedom. But this is in a social situation, right? By living in society. We have another situation if we look internally to ourselves, and we have the freedom of thought, for example. So this freedom of thought is something in us that escapes all embarrassment. And in this case, we enjoy absolute freedom, Kardec says, right? Because in my thought, I have no obstacles for that, right? I can be hindered in to manifest my thought, but that thought cannot be erased, right? So that's the situation here. The only thing here is that we are accountable for our thought, right? To God only, because God knows about our thoughts, and he condemns or absolves us according to the divine justice. So that is the only limit, let's say. Even that is not a limit, right? It's something that we have absolute freedom in this case. And from freedom of thought, we have the freedom of conscience. So it's a consequence. Freedom of conscience is a consequence of a freedom of thought. And Kardec explains that conscience is an inner thought that belongs to man, as do all other thoughts. One example of freedom of conscience is regarding belief, for example, right? I can choose the religion that I decided to follow, or I can choose not to follow any religion at all. So this is an example of a freedom of conscience. And Kardec points out that freedom of conscience is one of the characteristics of a true civilization and progress, because freedom is something very important, right? It's something that started since the time of Aristotle until now, and it's a great value of our civilization. So these two, freedom of thought and conscience, we have absolute, is absolute in us, right? So that's why about the lessons learned until now, we can say that living in society, we depend on each other, so we don't have absolute freedom in this sense. But if we look at the interiority of our being, then we have absolute freedom regarding thought and conscience. And regarding the freedom of conscience, one important lesson here is the need for tolerance towards those who think different from us, right? So then we can say that there is no absolute freedom in the social context, but there is in the context of the intimacy of a being. So this is what we have until now. Now we get to the free will, because from freedom we come to free will. What is free will according to the definition of the dictionary? It's something very similar to freedom, right? The definition is the possibility of deciding, choosing according to one's own will, free from any conditioning, reason, or decisive cause. Very similar to Aristotle's definition. And Kardec says that humans act with free will, because since they have a freedom of thought, they have a freedom of action. Doesn't mean that we can act the way we want to do, right? Because then we have live in society, we have laws, but we have always we have the free will in the sense of a freedom of a choice here, right? Because without free will, Kardec says, human beings would be like machines. So that's a very important power of the soul, right? Our soul. And we have some reflection of Saint Augustine. He lived there in the 4th to 5th century. In one of his books, The Order, where he reflects about the order that we have in the universe, right? So who set this order in the universe? Of course, he's reflecting about God, right? So there he make a question to himself: how can it be that while God takes care of human things, there is so much perversity in human things? By simplifying, why does evil exist in the universe, right? So doesn't God care about these petty and tiny things, Augustine asked, right? And of course not, because right, because that would be contrary to the divine providence, because the divine providence looks for everything, right? And also Augustine asks, or are all bad things committed by God's will? Well, that would not be for sure, right? Because that would be contrary to to God's kindness and mercy. So the question is still in the air and unanswered, right? Why evil existed in the world? So he will continue his reflection in another book, which is whose title is Free Will, right? So in this book, Augustine says that there are two forms in which evil manifests itself: suffering and guilt. And suffering it is caused by guilt. And who is responsible for guilt? We ourselves, right? So what is guilt then? Guilt, Augustine says, is to submit human reason to passion, to disobey divine laws. And so that is where guilt comes from, right? When we follow our passions, our instincts, and not act according to the divine laws. And where does this kind of action come from? And then the answer is it comes from free will. And then Augustine asked, well, then if God created the free will, did God create the bad thing? He asked, right? And then he himself answered, no, of course not, because free will is the condition of morality. If we didn't have free will, we would not be moral beings, like, for example, in the animal kingdom. The rational animals, they don't have free will. They act only by instinct. They have some intelligence, as we'll see in the Genesis from Kardec, but it's an intelligence only limited to their basic needs, right? They don't have free will in the sense that we humans do have, right? So there in the animal kingdom, there is no morality. But among humans, we have morality because of the free will. So that's why it's a good thing. Without free will, Kardec says, human would be neither guilty in evil nor meritorious in good. So morality is strictly connected to good and evil, right? So, and that comes from free will. But free will, if we have a free will, we also have a responsibility, according to what Leon Denis says in the book The Problem of Life and Destiny, right? So there, Denis says that freedom, or free will in this case, is the necessary condition for the human soul, which without it cannot build its destiny. So in order for us to build our destiny, we must have a free will, because if someone else decided about our destiny, then we wouldn't have any free will, and then we wouldn't be any merit for being good or evil, right? So, but if we have a free will, we also have a responsibility. So that's why Denis says that free will and responsibility are correlative in man's being and augment with our elevation. And what is interesting that he says that the responsibility is established by the testimony of our own conscience. So that is interesting, because here we can remind the question 621 from the Spiritist book, where Kardec asks, where the God's laws is written? So the answer is in the conscience, right? So that's why everything we do, we have the testimony of our own conscience, which approves or blames our actions, because the law of God is in our conscience. So even if your spirit is not evolved, the law of duty is there, right? Like a lighthouse, Denis says, through the fog of passion and self-interest. So this is something important to us, right? We are responsible for our acts. That's why we have the law of cause and effect, or karma, like Marcia mentioned in the beginning, right? So, but apparently Kardec looks through some apparent hindrances to free will. It seems that in some situations in our lives, we don't have free will. So this is some situation that Kardec raised here. For example, he asked if there aren't some predispositions that we bring at birth, and that are an obstacle to exercise our free will. So this Spiritist answers to Kardec that instinctive predisposition arise from those before the incarnation. So we bring with us some predisposition, some instinctive predisposition, which can incite us to reprehensible acts. But what the Spirit says is that there is no irresistible incitement of if we have the will to resist. So that's what he's explaining here, right? So there is this instinctive predisposition is not something that is determine us and take from us free will. And the second situation is about the organism, right? So Kardec asks the Spirit before us, saying that we have our organism, right? And we have these organisms have an influence on our actions. So doesn't that apart us from our free will? And then the answer is, well, we are certainly influenced by matter or by our body, right? Because we have our organic aspect of our life. But it's not our body that gives faculty to us as spirit. And then, for example, the Spirit says, if an individual has an instinct for murder, it's not his body which has it is this instinct, right? But it is the spirit that possesses it. The third situation Kardec asks if it is the situation where a person, for example, have a mental impairment. Well, if a person have a mental impairment, he doesn't have a free will regarding choice. In that case, the free will in such person would not be there. And then the answer is that those whose intelligence is impaired, for sure, is not in control of their thought. But why is that? Because such distortion is a punishment for the spirit for a bad use of its faculties in another existence. So it's in a previous existence. So in any way, at the end of the day, this consequence of this impairment is a consequence of a free act that the spirit had in its previous existence, right? So free will is not hindered here anyway. Next situation is distortion of an intellectual faculty because of drunkenness. A guy get drunk and then he, for example, driving a car, he kills someone, right, with his car. As he's drunk, he's not in control of his thought, right? So the answer is drunkard intentionally depriving himself of his reason to satisfy his passion, right? In this case, instead of one wrong, he commits two, right? The first is to deprive himself of reason by drinking, right? And the second is in this situation of a drunkard, he hits someone, right, in the street with his car. So there are two bad commitments here. And also another situation is the social position. Sometimes a person, because of his social position, he must follow, for example, some formalities regarding his social behavior, and doesn't that is a hindrance to his free will? And the answer is, well, yes, the world has its demands, but God holds us responsible for the tiny efforts that we make to overcome such obstacles, right? So this is also no reason for not having a free will, right? So at the end of the day, there is no situation where free will is completely moved away from us, right? We always have the free will. And then the next issue here is about free will and determinism. So we have always this discussion in Spiritism, right? So there Kardec asked about fatalism, right? So he asked if there is fatalism in the event of a life. Uh, for example, a situation of a persons who, no matter what they do, they seem to be pursued by fatalism. So why is that, right? So this is the answer here from the Spirit is that fatalism only exists when applied to the choice made by the Spirit upon incarnating to undergo this or that trial. So this is what generally we call destiny, right? So what is the situation here? What the Spirit is saying is that we, before we incarnate, when we were there in the spirit world, before incarnating, we choose some trials that we are going to go through while incarnated, right? So that is going to happen. So that is when we are here incarnate, it seems that it's a fatalism, but the reality is that we chose that, right, before incarnate. So in this case, it was a consequence of our free will. It's not our free will now incarnated, but it's a consequence of our free will before incarnate. So there is no determinism in that sense here, right? So, and also the Spirit says that that is only for trials of a physical nature. For example, for example, Kardec gives some similar examples in another part of his books, where, for example, if I was a bad orator in my past life, right? I use my speech to lead the people to do evil things, for example. Then before incarnating, I think that I say, well, if I incarnate with this quality of an orator, I may be repeat what I did before. So let's have some impairment here, right? In this vocal organ, for example, so that I cannot repeat the same that we did before. In this case, I choose, right? I chose what would be my situation here, and that is a trial of a physical nature. But regarding the moral trials and temptations, we always preserve our free will to resist, right? For example, a person can choose to incarnate in an environment where you have evil, right? So, and then that is a trial that he chose to resist to the temptation, and while incarnate, he always have the free will to resist to that temptation, right? So that is the main difference here regarding physical and moral trial. Another situation that Kardec asks the Spirit is, can we, through our own will and effort, avoid events that were to occur? Suppose that we chose some trial to go through here while incarnate. Can we avoid? And the answer, yes, we can. If this deviation, apparent deviation, fits in the general order of the life that we have chosen. And for example, if we come here and we decided to do good, right? And then we can prevent evil, like we always say in Spiritism, that we can repair our faults from the past, not only by suffering, but also by doing good, by love, right? So that is a situation that the Spirit Emmanuel tell us in this book before Jesus. There is this text here, spiritual remuneration. Uh, what Emmanuel says that when work becomes pleasure to serve, the most important point of the spiritual remuneration arises. So when we decided to do always good here while incarnate, there is this interesting situation that whenever divine justice seeks us at the exact address for execution of the sentences we draw against ourselves, could be, for example, that the time of passing away has come, or we would go through some serious accident, for example, and but if we the divine justice find us in service to others, then the divine mercy commands that execution be suspended indefinitely, right? So this is a situation where we can change or let that situation of a trial, right? So uh, this is something interesting here. Well, here we see also the free will, because we decided to do good, and for doing good we have good as consequence, right? Another situation here we can see, and it's not a situation where this is an explanation from the gospel according to Spiritism, right? So why there is suffering in the world, and why some suffer more than others, right? So why some are born in poverty and others in opulence. So then Kardec says there, right? So the vicissitudes of our lives have a cause, right? And God is just. So if God is just, then such cause must be also be just. Then Kardec explains there, right, that the reason for our suffering can be from our present life or past lives, right? If we, for example, regarding the present life, the suffering that we have from our present life are the natural consequences of our character, right, and behavior. But if we cannot find the reason in our present life, for example, if I eat too much, for example, I will probably will have some illness in our because of that, right? So, but sometimes, as in the case of the mental or physical impairment that we mentioned before, that cannot be found in the present life because, right? Because we have born already with that impairment. So in this case, the reason is in the previous existence. So always, at the end of the day, always is from our free will. Right? If not in this life, it is in a previous life. So there is no determinism here either, right? And what are the lessons learned here? That there is no fatalism in our life, although there is the determinism of the law of cause and effect, the karma that Marcia mentioned in the beginning. Everything that we do have a consequence, right? If we do good things, we have good consequences. If we do bad things, we have a bad consequence. So this is the law of cause effect, and it's a part of the law of God. But what another lesson that we have here is that the external circumstances, no matter how they may embarrass us in the bodily sense, or in the corporeal sense, never do so in the moral sense, if we so decide, right? So this is very important because it means that in our mind we always have our free will, right? It's not affected by anything. Now, let's talk regarding this issue of free will determinism. Let's talk a little bit about the knowledge of the future. This is related to the determinism issue, right? Because if we knew the future, then it means that our life would be determined. Right? So that's why Kardec says that generally speaking, the future cannot be revealed to us, because if we knew the future, we would neglect the present, right? And well, if we know already what will be happening to us, either good or bad, then we would stay idle, right? Because there is nothing that we could do to change the future. So that would be the denegation of free will, right? So there is no sense on knowing the future here. And that's why Kardec, it's not Kardec, the Spiritist said, right, that God willed it to be this way so that each one of us may contribute to the accomplishment of things, even those things that we would like to avoid, right? So that's the intelligence of God. But sometimes the spirits say that God allows the future to be revealed. So in some specific situations, for example, if a particular foreseen event would facilitate the accomplishment of things instead of preventing them. So in that situation, we could have some hint of the future, right? And also, by knowing something of our future, that lead us to act differently than we would have if the revelation would have not been made to us. So always there is a, a, a reason, right? A good reason for not being revealed the future to us, or in some cases to the future to be revealed. And another issue is regarding the foreknowledge of God, right? Because God knows everything. Right? God knows whether if I'm in front of I must take a moral decision. Well, and that moral decision, well, it means am I going to do good or bad or evil, right? God knows in anticipation what my decision will be. So in that case, do we have free will? So that is the question here from Kardec, right? So God knows whether a person will or will not fail in a particular trial, right? But then what is the need of the trial? Right? Because God knows already. And then the answer from the Spiritist is the purpose of the trial is not to enlighten God about the merit of the people, but to leave us, them or us, with the responsibility for our conduct, right? So the test is aims, the Spirit says, to put us before the temptation of evil, leaving us all the merit for resisting it. So even though God knows beforehand if we are going to triumph or fail, God can neither punish nor reward us for any act that we have not yet committed it. So that is a very interesting situation, right? Because God knows, but we don't know, right? So we are going to act freely. So regardless of God knowing what we are going to do or not, right? And we must decide freely in order for God to punish or reward us, right? Because if we would act according to God's will, for example, then we would have no merit of something that we did of good or bad, right? So in that case, God could not punish or reward us for that. So this is a very complex but interesting situation here. Leon Denis have another point of view, right? So, well, everything is similar here, but he looks from another aspect here. He asks, how can we conciliate free will with divine prescience, right? So the same situation, right? We have free will, we can decide, but God knows already in anticipation what decision we are going to take. Well, in that case, how we can conciliate? And then he says the same that the Spiritist says in the Spiritist book, right? God knows each of us in our most hidden recesses, and And then God can deduct the determination we will in our freedom take. But then Denis says, this provision of our acts by God does not give them birth. So it's not the fact that God knows in anticipation what we are going to decide that determine what we will decide, right? So we decide by ourselves, regardless of God knowing or not. So, for example, Denis said, even if God did not foresee what we are would going to do or decide, we would nevertheless have our free course to decide. So in that way, our human freedom and divine providence can be reconciled and combined. So it's a very another interesting reflection here from Denis, right? So at the end of the day, from everything that we saw until now, is that our free will is always preserved, right? In any situation. So that's a very valuable power that we as soul have with ourselves, right? And given by God. Um, so then we're going, now we are going, coming back again to the relationship between free will and freedom. But freedom now talking about the true freedom. Right? So free will is we have the power to choose, right? In freedom, we have the power also to decide about what we are going to do. But what is the connection between free will and freedom? So for now we have again Saint Augustine, right? He's reflecting there, right? Not now in the Spiritist book, but there in the 4th to 5th century when he was incarnate here as a bishop of the Catholic Church, right? So he says that freedom, what is freedom at the end of the day? Freedom is the power to use free will well. So that is interesting because when we have a free will, in a moral sense, we can do good or we can do evil, right? So, but freedom is the good use of a free will. Well, a good use of a free will means that we use free will only to do good and never to do bad. So this is freedom for Augustine. This is true freedom, right? So that's why he says that being able not to do so, the possibility of doing evil is inseparable from free will. We must have a free will to do evil, right? But being able not to do evil is the password of a freedom. So that's what he explained here. Right? And get to the point where we can no longer do evil is the supreme degree of a freedom. We can think about Jesus, for example, right? Do Jesus have some in his does he have free will? Of course he does, right? But how Jesus use his free will? Does he think about us in some situation that we can do good or do bad? No, Jesus always do good, right? So this is he can no longer do evil. So this is supreme degree of freedom, Augustine says. So that is very intelligent reflection, right? So from him is this expression here in Latin, right? Libertas vera est Christo servire, which means true freedom is to serve Christ, right? Which means always do good and never do evil. And we can no longer do evil, right? So this is where we free will find true freedom. And when are we going to reach that, right? Well, as we evolve through our reincarnation, we are going to perfection, and when we get to this point of perfection of the point where we become pure spirits, then we will have true freedom. then we use our free will, always we'll use our free will well, right? So that's what the reflection of Saint Augustine here say. And Leon Denis says the same, right? Because in the same book that I mentioned before, right, the problem of life and destiny, that I talked about that in the last year here, right? So Denis says that a human being is not really ripe for freedom until the universal exterior laws of God, of course, become interior and a part of his consciousness. So the law of God comes from us, from religion, for example, right? It is external. But then when we assimilate those laws in our and becomes a part of our consciousness, then we are ripe for freedom. Denise is saying here, right? Actually, as I mentioned before, the God's laws is already in our consciousness, right? The only thing is that we still are not conscious, fully conscious of that, right? As we evolve, then we will fully conscious of such laws. And then Denis says, right, the day when we are penetrated with the law of God and we make it the rule of our actions, then we attain the moral point where we, as human beings, possess, dominate, and govern ourselves. So that is the situation of the true freedom, the good use of free will, like uh, Saint Augustine said there before in the 14th to 15th century, right? So this is what I would like to bring today, these reflections from the Spiritist book about the free will and true freedom. Final consideration here is that, well, as I said, nothing constrains our free will, right? Nor the supposed determinism. We saw that there is no determinism in our life. If there is some determinism in our life, is regarding the laws that God has set to us, right? For example, the law of progress. That is the determinism, determinant for us, right? Because each one of us will evolve, whether we want or not, right? So this is a kind of determinism, but it's a good determinism, right? Something that was set for God. But regarding our actions to evolve, the pace as we decided to evolve, faster or slower, that's up to us, right? So absolute freedom, Kardec says, may not be possible in the social context, right? We must abide for the laws, right? The human laws. But absolute freedom is certainly possible in the intimacy of our being, right? So that's what the final consideration here, and some recommendations for all of us is to have a clear perception of the external, for example, the laws, and internal boundaries, for example, some physical impairment that we might have, for example, right? And then from that point, we would see the possibilities available, always aiming for good. So the good use for free will, right? And then we would act according to ethical principles, and we would be aware that we act aiming for good, but the result belongs to God. It doesn't depend on us, right? And that would be to act with disinterest, which implies freedom. And then we have in the Gospel according to Spiritism, that text which says about the moral person, right? The chapter that it talks about it, be perfect. And who are the moral persons, right? So are those who practice the law of justice, love, and charity, uh, those who know the vicissitudes of life are trials and expiations, and accept them without complaining, those who have tolerance for the thought of others and do not anathematize those who don't think like they do, those who study their imperfections and strive incessantly to combat those imperfections, well, these kind of moral persons, we can see that they are truly free. So that's with this, we finished this presentation today, and now I'm open for any question or observation you may have. Thank you.
Hello, back to everyone. It is so good to be here again to ask you, Roberto, the questions that we received, right? So this is really interesting. So let's see what we have.
Hmm.
Hi, Yasko. Yasko Arakawa is asking you. Hello, Mr. Watanabe. Very fascinating and complex topic. I fully agree, Yasko. In the case of the spirit that reincarnates with both physical and mental impairment, how will its evolution operate if its free will as well as its responsibility limited?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, I saw the other day some live from Yasko. Glad to have this question from her. Um, well, when the person have, for example, a physical impairment, that doesn't is really an obstacle for his or her free will, right? Because uh, it's not just a physical impairment, but it's something that, of course, is impaired his decisions. But in the physical aspect, like Kardec said there in the Spiritist book, but never the moral decisions that it may have, right? So, so physical aspect is not any obstacle for moral decision. Regarding mental impairment, well, in that case, yes, the person has not free will in the fullest sense, right? Because it's not in control of his thought or her thought. But in that case, or what we learned from the Spiritism literature is that sometimes the spirit needs some, let's say, some rest, right? Because this impairment is caused by a previous action from this spirit, and by these bad actions that he did in the past, he actually he affected his perispirit or his fluidic body, and then his perispirit is disbalanced. So the mental, the physical, the mental impairment is a consequence of that. And in this incarnation, where this person comes with these mental impairments, is a kind of a situation that he must go through to reestablish the balance of his perispirit. Because then in the next incarnation, then he will come, let's say, without any impairment. So this is an explanation. Another situation here is that when regarding the people who must take care of these people, right? So because, for example, if I have a son, for example, which is have a mental impairment, well, in some way, taking care of him is something that is related to me also, because I have some participation in that situation. And now I have to take care of him. And if I do that, I'm I have a good use of my free will. That is this complex situation, because it involves not only the person, but also the relatives and those who are around them, right? So that is the answer that I would give to Yasko.
Yes, thank you. And I would just like to say, sorry, that the notion of cause and effect, right? That law of cause and effect is so complex. It's not a linear. This happens because of this, and as such, this will be the effect. Like Isaac Newton did with the
Yeah.
third law of physics. But from a spiritual point of view, we start to saying, like you said, Roberto, that maybe what your son is undergoing physically, mentally in this
Mm.
life is completely related to other people, including you or potentially you. So, absolutely. Thank you. So, let's go to the next question. And we received a comment from the United Spirits Federation YouTube page that says, in
Mm.
addition to environmental influences, we also suffer the influence of the spiritual world. If that is the case, Roberto, who is responsible for actions in those cases? And I think we can talk about perhaps who is to blame. I was not to blame. Somebody did that to me. So can you talk a little bit about it?
The answer is, the answer is we are always to blame.
That is terrible,
Because,
isn't it?
yeah, because the influence of the spiritual world, yes, we see in the Spiritist book that regarding the influence of the spirit on our lives, right, which is much greater than we might think. Uh, well, the Spirit says there, say there that there are situations there where they lead us right in our action.
Mhm.
But what important to say here is that. The kind of information that we have in our lives depend on us. That's why we are to be blamed for any influence we may have in our life. Meaning that, for example, if we think about obsession, right? Why do I get obsessed by an evil spirit? Because in some way, I give a reason for that to happen. So it's in myself and not in the spirit. Because if I'm thinking good, I'm balancing my mind, there is no bad evil spirit that will going to obsess with me because there is no affinity, right? That there is no connection. So that's why we are always responsible for ourselves. So free will is something that is almost absolute in our life.
Yes. May I add something, Roberto? And I apologize, but this is one of those potentially pet peeves of mine. I always bring this idea because in the language of Spiritism, think in terms of 19th century language, right? We talk a lot about evil, good and evil, that
Mm,
duality in our lives,
mm,
and this is now the age of Hollywood and Marvel
mm,
movies, right? That mythological view of good and evil becomes super extraordinary, good,
mm,
good and evil. And I think maybe it's important for us to stop and think about what is evil and
mm,
what is good. And by
mm,
that definition, then, as you know, Spiritism it really breaks down the idea of evil is just somebody who may not be as aware
mm,
as evolved, therefore, that those actions are lesser, right?
mm,
Of a lesser enlightened spirit. So I just wanted
mm.
to bring that up because it's important for us to always remote to that, to the fact that when we say evil spirit may influence us, maybe just a spirit that may be not as evolved or
Yeah.
maybe a suffering spirit, right? Etc. Etc.
Yeah, no, you're sure, Marcia, you're right, because we have for sure this kind of a language today, right? Well, we are good, they are evil, so that's a kind of is not something that's correct. Well, the point is that we are imperfect beings, right? Still are imperfect
Mm-hmm.
beings. So evil comes from that. Saint Augustine that I mentioned, he you see in there in the fourth century, he was reflecting about the some this evil, and he said about that there is, for example, the metaphysical evil.
Mm-hmm.
Metaphysical evil comes from our imperfection. We are imperfect. That's why we do wrong, let's say. But just not say evil, bad. We do it wrong, right? And then we have the moral evil, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
then it's related to free will. And
Yes.
then we have the physical evil, let's say, which is the consequence of the moral evil. So this is a kind of a reflection that he did at his time. But you're right. We should think about imperfection, not about this good and evil, like two divine beings, right? Or like some religion from the past, for example, the Persian religion from Zoroaster, for example. They had the uh, God of good and God of evil, something like that. Of course, that doesn't have any sense for us.
Yes, the duality exists, but exists inside of us because we are imperfect spirits seeking perfection. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing that we're talking here today. But let's see if we have another question. There is another one from the Facebook page. How is the notion of the law of cause and effect an evidence of the divine justice and God's attributes of omniscience? I cannot say the all-knowing, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, supremely good.
Well, the attributes of God, this is well, when we study about God, we have these attributes here, which is
Mhm,
our colleague is saying here.
mhm,
But the law of cause and effect is something that is not directly related to these attributes here, right? Because the law of cause effect is something that is related to us as
mhm,
creatures of God, right? So
mhm.
um, it means that as we have the laws of cause effect is directly connected to free will, which is the issue of today's presentation, right? Because as we have free will, we have actions, free actions, and from that actions, the consequences follow. That's why they need connect the uh, freedom with responsibility, right? Because we
Yes.
are responsible for acts. So this is what the cause effect means, but that applies to us as let's say as creatures of God, God's creatures. But the attributes of God is something different. Is something that is related to only to Him. Let's say, right? So there
Yeah,
is.
but I think you talked to Roberto earlier, right? And the whole discussion on all knowing and yet being good, supremely good, it allows us to learn. So it's not a punitive God from its cause and effect. It's because there's goodness and there's justice that we own our mistakes as well as we own our good deeds, right? I think that's what I read from that question.
Yes, yes, and also we also talk about the foreknowledge of God, right? So
Yes,
the
yes, yeah,
omniscience means that God knows everything, but that
yes,
doesn't uh, affects directly our free will anyway, right? Like
yes.
we saw.
Awesome, awesome. Let's see if we have another question. Maybe we have maybe another time for another question too. So in the YouTube page of the U.S. Spiritist Federation, we ask, can you please, Roberto, speak a little more about the concept of conscience based on the answer to question 835, is freedom of conscience the natural consequence of freedom of thought?
Mm. Well, they are closely related in the sense that as we have a freedom of thought, it
Mhm,
means that we may think whatever we want to, and if we
mhm,
want to think whatever we want to, we have the freedom to choose. For example, the example that I gave, right?
mhm,
I can choose the political party that are going to follow, the religion that are going to follow, or I can choose not having any religion. And the freedom of conscience is in let's say is a practical application of the freedom of thought, right? Because I
mhm.
can think whatever I want to. I can decide for my life have a conscience of whatever I decided to do. So
Mhm.
that's in that sense, that is the natural consequence. I would say that thought is in our mind, right? Freedom, conscience is something that we choose in our practical life.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know if you have any other comment or questions. We do have one. If we reflect upon the law of progress, I think you mentioned earlier, right?
Mm.
The what showing determinism, then I guess free will can be evidenced by the choice of how and when we'll evolve as immortal spirits, right? So I
Mm.
think this is just a comment. Maybe you want to comment on the comment.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. The law of progress is a determinant, of course, because
Mhm.
all of us will go to reach perfection someday, some far away in the future, right? But someday we will get there. But the pace that we are going to do that, I mentioned that, right? That is on our free will. So
Mhm.
Kardec says in the I say Kardec, but actually it's the Spirit, right? In the Spiritist book, answering Kardec. They say that, for example, I can decide to stop. I don't want to evolve. I like the way I am today and don't want to change anything in my life. And then they say that, but there is some moment that life becomes so tedious that I'm urged to evolve. I'm urged to go forward, right? So
Mhm.
I can decide to stop. I never regress, right? I
Yes.
can decide to stop, but the direction is always going forward to perfection. So the pace we decide, but what we are going to reach, that's determined because determined by God. Everything that is determined by God is in cannot be changed by us, right? So this is another this is an interesting reflection that we could have in another situation, which is talking about what is uh, related to God itself and what is related to us, right? So
Mhm.
it's interesting situation here. It's some distinction that we must
Absolutely.
make.
Yes. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Roberto. I think we have reached the time with our questions. And oh, we have another one. So my
Mm,
apologies. So there is another one from the Facebook page asking you, Roberto. Oh, I love this question. Can you referred back and forth with two figures, right?
mm,
One from the 4th century, St. Augustine,
mm,
and the other one, Leon Denis, from the 19th century, right?
mm,
And they kept talking about free will along with Kardec's questions to the spirits. So
mm.
they said, you mentioned two authors who wrote about free will. Can you talk about their role in Spiritism specifically?
Mhm. Well, that's an interesting question because Saint Augustine in his time, there on the fourth to 15th century, he was a very intelligent person, right? So he had
Uh-huh.
some bright ideas about God, about everything, about free will. And but as a bishop of the Catholic Church, he was also abided to the dogmas, right, from
Uh-huh.
the church. So that is interesting because that is Saint Augustine there. But we have also the Saint Augustine of the Spiritist book, for example, of the Gospel according to Spiritism. Well, that's another Saint Augustine because Saint Augustine in the 19th century, who of course has none of those dogmas, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his role in Spiritism is very important. Is the Spirit Erastus recognized that in the first chapter of the Gospel, where
Awesome.
he says that Saint Augustine is a greater um, he was great participant of the Spiritist doctrine
Mm-hmm.
development, right? So that's what we can talk about him. Leon Denis is another person who was very important because some say that, for example, if Kardec in his free will, had failed in his mission, then the Spiritus had already a substitute for him, right? That would be Leon Denis. So
Mhm.
Leon Denis also uh, had a very important role in Spiritism. We studied almost all of his works last year. And then that's when I talked here about I think it was the first part of the problem for life and destiny. So
Mhm. That's
very important
awesome.
spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a plug for everyone. If you don't know either one, St. Augustine or Leon Denis, please research. They are seminal figures, as Roberto said. So I
Yeah.
think we have reached the end of our questions. And I want to say thank you. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone who watched today's talk and those who have been following our weekly Spirit Talk series. So next Saturday, I believe it is July 30th at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Please don't miss our next live. Bia Lopez will be discussing the concept of togetherness. And as we're about to end our live today, I would like to remind everyone this is such something that I'm so enthusiastic about, which is the virtual class initiation into Spiritism. It's, as I mentioned in the beginning of today's talk, it is every week we have a new release of the class, and it is, of course, free of charge, and it is created for anyone who's interested or who wants to know more about the basic principles of Spiritism. It is a class, a course with 30 lessons and 8 interactive Q&A sessions. And I believe we're about halfway through into the book. So the new lessons are released weekly on Sundays. So be on the lookout tomorrow at 10 a.m. to hear from Bia Lopez. And if you're interested, you can go to the U.S. Spiritist Federation website and you can click there and receive reminders by email. Roberto, before we close the live, would you be so kind to close with a prayer? I would appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you, Marcia, for this opportunity to be here again with you. And then, so let's close in our meeting today and thanking for the spiritual benefactors for all the support they give us in this presentation. Let's also thanks to Jesus for this opportunity to being here, reunited in His name. And after all, we thank God for this great power that He gave us, which is our free will, based on that such free will, we are going to evolve until our relative perfection. So thanks God for all this opportunity, this reincarnation where we could know the Spiritism doctrine that enlighten our minds about the most fundamental questions of our life. So be it.
So be it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.